was for us. I don't think they ever.
Real quick before we get started, guys. I just want to point out Dave Carson back here as well. If you don't know him, he works in all of our facilities. So as far as coming to you for contact, if he has like pilot funds or access to facilities, he's another good contact. More if you want to do preclinical facilities, I refer you to him other than me. Just want to make sure you guys know who he is. Other than that, Dennis, you want to take us away?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. So last time we talked about a little bit of the technicalities of working with multimodal AI. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about more clinical applications and then jump into something technical. So a little bit different from last time. But just to introduce today's talk, so as we all know, deep learning has the potential to transform healthcare with advanced data analytics from disease detection and preventative analytics. And some of the success stories that I'm going to highlight today span from imaging to enhancing personalized medicine strategies with complex heterogeneous data, so textual and image-based data. And the seminar goal for today is to examine innovative AI and ML tools and case studies that are redefining clinical practices with the goal of improving patient care and operational efficiencies. So just to preface or to get started, we know that there's a lot of AI medical devices that are beginning to be approved by the FDA. So there's 694 AI-enabled devices to date which have been approved, and the growth is pretty substantial. So we can see in this curve that there was a huge peak from 2015 onward, and year-over-year growth of AI enabled devices slowed a little bit in 2021 and 2022 compared to the previous year, 2020. However, we're seeing an uptick in this, and 87% of these devices, 122 were radiology based. So there's a huge number of AI based devices that are radiology based that are utilizing CNNs and other modalities for improving imaging.
Quick question, just one on from like obviously these AI models are being split as investigational devices is the category of the FDA. Might not be very clear, but I guess I'd be interested in what all goes into the submission for the FDA. And you guys have any sense of any hiccups that the FDA has had for approving these?
So my understanding is that you would need to submit an FDA 510K, which depending on the type of data that you're working with, whether that is image-based data or the sensitivities of it, will regulate which class of device you would need to seek approval for. So if you were doing something that basically a physician could do, but just improving the operational efficiency, that would likely be a class 1 or class 2 device. But as soon as you start working with imaging, I believe that that leads from class 2 to class 3. So anything imaging based is definitely going to require FDA 510K approval. And the approval process typically requires setting up a pilot and basically having an IRB and a pilot study to prove the efficacy of the tools that you want approval for. So I think that takes about 3 to 6 months for a class 1 or class 2 medical device. And for others, that can take a little bit longer.
Yeah, I think like more timely is that the FDA commissioner just a few days ago announced that they did not have staff, even close to the staff required to validate AI tools in radiology. And so I think one can only expect those times to go up. But there have been some interesting ideas about how these would be assured in the future. And I think there's been quite a big push to have these kinds of private assurance laboratories, which would be centered at research institutions such as this very one. So we might be seeing some interesting changes in regulations. I don't know how this goes, but I think there's a real demand for it.
Yeah, so I actually spent several months working at FDA and the device review team that deals with these submissions and got a lot of the few submissions go through the full process. They're basically all class 2 devices. They are mostly 510Ks, like I'd say 95% of them are 510Ks halfway, which means they're based on a predicate and they all share the same predicate. If you go back like far enough in the inheritance, there was like a fracture detection CAD algorithm that came out like 15 years ago or something. That's the predicate for all of the AI submissions that are getting cleared by FDA now. The time course varies depending on it. It's worth noting that there is no mechanism right now for like adaptive AI that learns. You have to lock the algorithm. And if you want to retrain it, you have to submit a new 510K, usually with the prior as the predicate. So that thing that there are a lot of people like Matthew Diamond wrote like a white paper for FDA on kind of like basically some possible framework for monitoring and clearance of adaptive algorithms. So that is, they're nowhere near at a point where they have an infrastructure that can accommodate that. They're basically clearing these devices the same as they did CAD devices. And almost all of these are under a device code that makes them like CAD triage devices. I think that's the most popular kind of foot in the doorway to do it, where technically it's not something that actually performs a clinical task. It's something that reorders your work list, basically. Because the bar is lower for what you have to show. Maybe for stroke detection, you just have to show that during needle time might be improved for a certain set of people, but you don't have to actually like tie it that like outcomes based on just the AI making a diagnostic decision. So reader studies are like a requisite for all of these.
Which is a pathway around something impacted clinical.
Yeah, so you have to be like very mindful. And the one thing that they are able to do is just make sure that the label indications for use on each of these devices matches the way that the experiments were set up to validate them. But that gets fuzzy when we look at some of the like marketing materials that not the written indication for use, but the promo data. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think FDA 510K or FDA device regulation could be a really useful seminar entirely on its own. Like, I think like maybe you and I can talk and a few others, anybody who's interested, and maybe we can set that up. But it's something that I'm vaguely aware of, but I would like to learn a little bit more about the process myself. But yeah, let's discuss further. For the context of today's talk, the main focus is that radiology dominates, followed by cardio and neurology in terms of receiving approvals, FDA 510K devices. And this curve is pretty exponential, so it's growing. In terms of success stories, natural language processing for clinical documentation has been used pretty substantially over the past few years. So I'm sure people here use Dragon or other tools for taking notes or recording sessions. So that has been implemented with GPT-4 for automated clinical documentation, and that helps significantly with taking notes while you're like in the reading room or while you're doing a patient case. So I'm sure everybody here is somewhat familiar with annotation tools. Another case study is the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, which utilized natural language processing through an Amazon-based service to take a ton of patient charts, turn those into useful documentation. So it's a combination of OCR, optical character recognition for retrieving the data from the charts, and then taking that and using that to fine-tune a large language model with a RAG-based implementation. So there's a lot that is happening in terms of natural language processing, and there's a lot of potential to utilize some of these services through Amazon to improve the experience. So in terms of AI for radiology, these are some companies that are focused in the space. There's a few that we're familiar with, like Flywheel, which is a WashU spin out. There's been a lot of discussion around MD AI as well, but this is a pretty big space, and there's a lot of competitors. It's a pretty there's a lot going on in AI for radiology. There's a few that have FDA clearance for viewing. MDAI recently received FDA clearance for viewing DICOM images, but I think it's a pretty simple um, um, application that they filed basically just to render DICOM images. But the main point is there's a lot of companies in this space that are having success utilizing a combination of imaging and textual models. Another success story that is potentially interesting is blockchain and AI for secure patient data exchange. So there's been a lot of talk about blockchain in the past where people have said that it's going to change the way money works. I see more application in terms of securing data. There's a lot of potential for working with patient data and securing it in a blockchain where there's a distributed ledger and the data is encrypted. So for example, there was a data hack at Lurie recently where they were down for like 2 weeks. With the blockchain enabled technology, if the patient data was encrypted and distributed across a ledger, a distributed ledger, then basically hacks like this become impossible because there is no one data source. The data lives across a distributed ledger and it would greatly improve cybersecurity potentially if the data is encrypted properly. There's been some success stories where Japanese companies have used this for pharmaceutical research. So partnered with hospitals, they've been able to actually work together to retrieve data from hospitals and utilize that through a blockchain, an Amazon managed blockchain service, and actually take that data and you kind of like in a distributed way where you have multiple sites and all of that data is then pushed to the blockchain and utilized for pharma research purposes. So this is another success story or application. So in terms of how I see healthcare evolving in the near term, patient-centric AI solutions are the future. So in general, there's going to be a lot of work where AI is utilized to improve the patient experience in terms of making sure that data is shared back from the patient to the hospital and ultimately making the patient the core focus. So multimodal AI and distributed data systems can be used to develop healthcare ecosystems that offer personalized and integrated patient experiences. There's a lot of push towards chronic condition management. There's a lot of companies being developed out of that, where they're trying to use AI to prevent and manage chronic conditions. Apple has been working in this space for a long time with Health Kit and Research Kit. So Apple supports a lot of infrastructure, even from the research and clinical side, for creating applications that allow for collecting patient data and then using that internally. So the main takeaway is that collective migration to AI-based solutions can solve healthcare inefficiencies. And a lot of companies are migrating from layers of engagement and layers of infrastructure into layers of intelligence. So all of these consumer companies and infrastructure companies are moving into the intelligence layer, trying to see how they can serve patients, how they can serve the individual user in a more efficient way. So I'm seeing a shift from healthcare being kind of a locked-in service where it's really hard to access your data. You have to wait a few days even to receive your chart from like MyChart or something, to being a more integrated service where the patients can have access and actually utilize their data in a smart way. Something like having ChatGPT to explain your chart and the medical conditions that you're experiencing. So some of the challenges encountered are the difficulty of obtaining diverse high volume data sets for training. So those data sets exist. However, making those available for training purposes is a big deal. That's something that we discussed last time. We have data sources here, huge data lakes that could be used to train very comprehensive machine learning models. The question is, how do we move them from these data lakes into an algorithm and then deploy that algorithm. So that's something that is kind of an open discussion that me and Scott are open to chatting about as well. But it's an open problem. How do you make that more efficient and ultimately make that data available and train models with the huge data sources? It's been done at enterprise in some cases, but I think that shift still needs to happen in healthcare. And then there's the question of how do you know that the model is good? So a lot of these deep learning models are black boxes, which complicate the understanding of decision-making processes. So how do you know what the model is actually seeing and doing? That's something that we'll touch on a little bit later. Another question is compliance and ethics. So how can you ensure that ethical considerations are being used? In particular, are you sourcing a well-balanced data set? Are you training algorithms that represent everybody? So that is a question. Bias is a huge consideration. And then for clinical integration, how do you actually take these models and make them useful? So there's been some companies, Sectra, which is moving towards implementing models through a model hub based approach. Scott, I think you had mentioned something about that. But there needs to be a way to actually take these models and make them useful. So that's a big question. And then also consistent performance. How do you take these models and ensure that you're checking up on them and making sure that they're performing well all the time? So an active learning framework is kind of necessary. So this is a challenge that researchers need to rise and accept. And I actually have a QR code here for a challenge from challenge.gov. It's something related to utilizing radiology data sets for AI. So there's a $50,000 prize associated with this. This could be something where like people who are training their first models could potentially take a stab at working with the challenge. So they have a multimodal and a single modal based challenge that is currently open. That was announced like yesterday.
You know, and on top of that, Y Combinator just, I think last week came out with its first update to its call for startups. That's done what 5 years or something like that. And MRIs were, you know, specifically targeted as one of the things that they want for new startups as well. So I think there's a lot of interest in addressing these challenges, you know, from different aspects.
Yeah, ML is utilizing AI. That is a big focus, but then also healthcare is a big focus in the Y Combinator call. So Y Combinator is like one of the biggest investors in pre-seed or seed stage startups in the country. It's kind of like the gold seal of approval that you've made it as a startup. So
And even more so, they're a big matchmaker. So, you know, all of the large, you know, venture capital funds would kind of work with Y Combinator.
Yeah.
To fund.
Yeah. So they take people based on ideas alone sometimes. So like if you have a good team, like for startups at the earliest stage, they're looking for a good team of people who have a great idea. So like if people here were interested in entrepreneurial considerations, all you would really need is a good team and a good idea to present to Y Combinator. And I think they opened applications, like late or early applications closed yesterday or fairly recently, but they do have open applications right now for spring. And they provide $500,000 in funding to get your startup started. So in terms of working with patient data, there's always a question of how do I know that the data is balanced? So one solution for this is clustering algorithms. You can utilize unsupervised clustering techniques like k-means clustering and PCA or other visualization methodologies to try and see the data space a little bit more clearly. So this is a common technique that can be used to help solve the challenge of reviewing your data sets. Next session, I'll go a little bit more into this in depth, but I just wanted to present the idea today. that you can take a data set based of text and actually look at the distribution in a PC space and determine how well balanced the data is. And then utilizing clustering, you can find clusters within the data that might represent some unique combination of features. You can then take those clusters and rebalance the data sets where, like, let's say you have an imbalanced data set like red versus yellow flowers. You can utilize either oversampling or undersampling to balance the data sets. In oversampling, what you want to do is you want to generate new images of the minority class to fill in the blanks to make sure you have an equal distribution of data. So in this case, it's utilizing oversampling where they have a minority of yellow flowers. They're generating new images or finding new images of yellow flowers to balance out the data set, and you now have a balanced data set. In undersampling, what you want to do is you want to find the minority class and then sample accordingly to make sure that you have a balanced data set. So you might choose some random points from red, blue, and purple to create an equal distribution of points that matches the yellow data set here. So that is how you ensure that you are working with a well-balanced data set that might mitigate bias. So once you have a well-balanced data set, you can actually train models and peek into the black box. So people always say that deep learning models or neural nets are kind of a black box. You don't really understand what's going on, but there are mathematical techniques that allow you to peek into the black box and understand it a little bit more fully. So there's techniques like integrated gradients and feature ablation, which allow for taking a baseline image and then looking at the model and seeing which features are contributing from the baseline to the predicted model, and ultimately contributing to positive and negative classification of individual pixels. You can look at layer activations and layer attributions. You can actually visualize those with saliency maps to try and understand which part of the image is contributing to the model's classification. And there's a variety of techniques that allow for evaluating what is actually going on within a deep learning model. You can compare to other models, and you can also look at other interpretations of the model. So I have here actually a demo where what we're doing is we're pulling some X-ray images of a pneumonia versus a normal patient data set. And we can actually use that data to train a convolutional neural net in a very simplified way. So this example goes through the process of training a simple CNN using an off-the-shelf model. So we're using ResNet 18, which is a foundational model which was developed for classifying pictures of cats, dogs, real-world images. But you can take this model and you can retrain it for radiology purposes fairly simply. So I'm just going to step through this model today and explain some of the major components that comprise training your own model. This will be made available to everybody as well, so you can play with it afterward, and then next session you can ask questions. But I'm just going to step with the basics. So I'm pulling a data set here. It's a publicly available pneumonia data set. And just stepping through the key components. So we load all of the necessary libraries that we're going to be using. We have here just some information about the batch size, the number of workers that we're going to use, the number of epochs, and the learning rate. That's going to be important for training the model later. When we first read in these data points, however, these images, they're not all the same shape. So we need to make everything more or less the same shape. That way we can use it within the deep learning model. So we apply a set of transforms. So transforms are a way of taking images, doing something to them, to make it useful for machine learning purposes. So in this case, I'm using a series of transforms. First, I'm taking an image, converting it to a tensor, normalizing those images to work best with the ResNet 18 model, because it was trained to work with images which have a certain normalization, a certain range of pixel values. And then I'm using a random resize crop. So what that means is I'm not using the full image, I'm randomly cropping within sections of the image. This is useful because it allows for actually learning individual features at a pixel level, as opposed to like taking a whole image and maybe it learns like there's a letter R or there's something that isn't really relevant. So a random resize crop is a really valuable transform to use in this case. So once we have the data that's been read in and transformed, we can actually use it. So we have a data loader and a data set. So those are like the two main components that comprise working with data. You have a data loader for loading in the images, and then a data set which comprises, it's a data set which helps with pulling in the images, and then the data loader sits on top of that and explains like the batch size that you'll use when you're actually training the model. So it basically packages the images into a little box that can then be passed to the model itself. So we have a training set and a test set. For this case, we have a training set that is 5,000 images and a test set that's about 600, so about a 90-10 split. I would recommend like 80-20 or so for most cases, but it's variable. The main point is you need to have a training set for actually training the model and a test set for verifying that the model is performing well for images that weren't contained in the training set. So just stepping through the classes that we have are normal versus pneumonia-based images. And you can see a visualization of some of these. So this is a normal image. This is one with pneumonia, normal and pneumonia. So based on the cropping, it may not capture the correct side. So like in this image here, I think this is probably the section without pneumonia, versus you can see clearly that there's pneumonia present in this image. So when you do cropping, there's considerations that need to be made to make sure that you capture the relevant features. So maybe the crop size isn't optimal in this case. However, there's enough images to where it should be able to learn what a lung with pneumonia looks like versus a normal lung. So this is the actual training loop. This is the meat and potatoes of the model. Basically, we're utilizing stochastic gradient descent with a cross entropy loss function to optimize between the predicted and the ground truth. So it's essentially just a for loop for a number of epochs where we step back and forth and try and optimize the model to be able to understand what represents at the pixel level a normal versus a pneumonia image. So this is pretty standard. You could probably take this training loop and use it anywhere, but we have a training phase and a test phase where basically we step through, we start with an optimizer, which is zeroed, and then we actually pass in the input model. The model in this case is ResNet 18, an off-the-shelf model where we didn't have to define a model at all. We just said use ResNet 18, and we were able to load that in and begin training the model immediately. So the loss is going to be the difference between the predicted and the ground truth. And that loss is kept track of as we step through the model. So let's see if I actually have here some of the main components. So I have this defined as a function that I'm using later. And when I'm actually using it, I'm defining the criterion that's used. So we're using cross entropy loss. We're using a stochastic gradient descent optimizer, and we're using a scheduler to optimize the steps that are taking well. Learning rate is adjusted on the fly. So I start with the learning rate, and then it's optimized accordingly. So basically, we'll have a loss curve, which should converge towards zero. So it's going to start relatively high, and then it'll converge towards zero. And in this case, we see the evolution of the train and test accuracy over each step. So it starts off fairly good, actually, at 78% accuracy on the test, sorry, on the train, and 72% accuracy on the test. And after 25 steps, we're able to achieve 92% accuracy on the train and 85% accuracy on the test. So even with a lesser number of steps, we're still able to achieve fairly high accuracy with this relatively small data set. I mean, 5,000 is kind of a realistic number in terms of the number of patient cases that are achievable. But the main point is you can very quickly take an off-the-shelf model with some base functions and your own data set and use this code or a similar code to train a model and do something with it. So we were able to achieve 85% accuracy on the test set. And I'm visualizing here some of the predicted versus actual images. So we can see that there was a misprediction here. This one was predicted as having pneumonia when it was labeled as normal, but for the majority of them, they were correct. And if we want to look at the actual confusion matrix, which explains how well the model did, we can see that it did fairly well. However, there were some miscategorized images. It would be interesting to look at these, understand why they were miscategorized. But going forward, we can actually use a tool called CAPTM, which utilizes integrated gradients and occlusion. These are two algorithms that are used to explain what's going on within the black box. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the model that we trained previously, and this is the actual description of the model. It's ResNet 18, so it's a 18-layer convolutional neural net. But the main point is we can take that model that we've trained and we can actually use it to examine what's going on inside. So this is utilizing integrated gradients, which takes a baseline, and from that baseline, it's able to compute the difference to a predicted image and visualize pixels that are contributing positively towards the classification. So this is based on this image as the baseline. We can see the most important pixels are in yellow. What it's showing me is that the pixels that are activated are corresponding more to the spine as opposed to the pneumonia spots in the lung. So maybe this model isn't good, but based on the accuracy that we saw previously, we would have said it's pretty good, like 92% on the test set. So this is an important step in terms of actually looking inside the box and trying to understand what the model is classifying. So this is with integrated gradients. There's another model or another explainable AI technique called occlusion, where certain areas of the image are occluded and the model is verified to see like what the attribution is of each component after occlusion. So we can see the positive and negative attributions from this image and see like what is corresponding. So again, we're seeing for a positive classification, it's kind of looking more in the spine area and less at the spots that might be contributing to or might be indicative of pneumonia. So what this is telling me is that this model, even though it's accurate, may not be learning the right features. So this could be improved by training the model with different crop sizes or with different considerations in mind. Maybe it needs to be trained a little bit longer. 25 epochs is fairly low. maybe if we let this run for 100 or 1,000 epochs, it would learn the correct features. But after 25 steps, what it's learned is that this group of pixels, which in my opinion looks like it's corresponding to the spine area and maybe a little bit of the outside ribs, is contributing to the positive classification, whereas these pixels, which in my opinion look more like the pneumonia spots, are contributing to a negative classification. So the main point that I'm getting at is that there are techniques for peeking into the black box, and it should be best practice for employing these techniques to understand what your model's learning. Because if we said, okay, 92% accuracy, it looks good, let's deploy it, it might be learning the wrong things. So it's really important to actually test and verify your models. But yeah, sorry to run through this a little bit quickly, but I want to present it at a high level and allow everybody to play with it on their own. And then if they have questions, we can step through the questions together in the next session.
Can you talk about how, like, we're getting started in the space, how you figure out like how much compute you need, you have a certain number of images or a certain number of CT scans?
Yeah, so for this example, I was just using Google Colab. They actually do have instances where you can connect to fairly good compute. So this is using an A100 GPU. However, I would base it on the number of images, the size of the images, because what is going to make that determination is the GPU memory. So GPU memory is going to give us some insight as to what size of compute you need. So if you have fairly small images, like let's say you're working with like super small, like 50 by 50 pixel images, then you could probably run that on your own machine. Versus if you're working with something that's like 2048 by 2048 and you want to utilize that full image, that's going to require a huge amount of GPU memory, depending on the batch size, like how many images you're passing at a time into the neural net. But the main considerations are going to be the size of your image, the number of images, and the batch size. So if you have very big images, you can always reduce your batch size up until like 2. But I would always recommend using the largest batch size that you can to train the best models. So it's going to be dependent on number of images and the size.
Yeah, and so like the batch size is going to be kind of what's bottlenecked by your memory. But they're pretty good scaling release that we have. We probably come up with those and kind of share them. That would make it easier.
Once you share this with us and want to play with it, we can't pull in any thing with HIPAA. We shouldn't be putting or research data because that shouldn't be up to we want to that. But we can't put any like bunch of research.
So I would
This is going outside.
yeah, this is going to Google. So what I would recommend is this is a good playground for like learning the basics. And once you are ready to run with your own data, you can contact me and Scott, and we'll get you set up on a compute that is HIPAA compliant, and you can use these same techniques with your own data on a much more powerful machine.
Yeah, we were actually just discussing that we would put this these notebooks and things on the CHPC so that people can play from there and that kind of thing as well.
Often you see people pulling medical image data, training using volumetric data, like is that a thing yet? Or?
Oh, I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, Amelia, it's totally, I mean, she's like a lot of her work is in PFP right now because it's not possible to do full volumetric data analysis on the machines that we had to date. She's going to be very happy next week when we have the first of our A100 machines out, which will allow her to do full volumetric analysis. Like, essentially taking several slices along a volumetric scan, like not the full dimensionality.
Got it.
Yeah, but the consideration when working with
But it's not going to utilize volume of the data at any given time. Basically, it treats them as different slices, not the entire image altogether.
I mean, it kind of does. It kind of depends on how you make the model. So like, I mean, you kind of think of these as, like, you know, they're all voxel, right, in space. And so you have like certain resolution in each dimension, which is full resolution, but you can downsample that into much lower resolution. You can kind of think of those layers as very coarse representation of the full volumetric scan in that dimension, but, you know, full resolution together. So I think that's what they do right now. The big limiter is memory on the GPUs. And so you just simply can't run these models on a GPU. That doesn't have enough memory. Oh, sorry, astronautology. It's in the CIRC. She does volumetric.
Oh, that's, yeah.
Yeah. So you also have to ask yourself what additional benefits you're getting out of moving to 3D. So are there unique features that can only be seen in 3D that you're getting out of 2D? So you can work slice by slice, for example, or you can reconstruct those 2D slices into a 3D volume and then use the 3D volume. When you move from 2D to 3D, your memory requirements blow up. And the question is there a sizable benefit for moving from 2D to 3D? Like within another area, like Tesla uses 8 video cameras on the edge of their cars versus actually using like 3D LiDAR, because you can get away with just taking 2D images and reconstructing something using a much lower memory requirement data source. It still is capturing the base information that's needed. So in radiology, the question is, are there features in 3D that are going to improve your models significantly versus working in 2D? And is it worth the cost of the additional memory?
You talk about, you mentioned like, you know, at the end, you'll have the results of the accuracy of the model, and you mentioned multiple ways you can try to alter things to improve the performance of the model. Talk about like the process of how you think about which things to alter. Is it just trial and error? Like, okay, I'll try increasing the epochs, or I'll try, you know, cropping images to different sizes, or is there like a specific way you think about making that?
So there's kind of 2 ways that you can think of it. There's a grid search based approach where you can say like, here's the full grid of parameters that I want to explore, like step through and explore all of these. Or there's the approach of utilizing Bayesian optimization based techniques for optimizing the space. So there's a tool called RayTune that would allow you to kind of set like a range of learning rates, a range of crop sizes, and basically have all of those things be tuned using Bayesian optimization to find the optimal minimum of the space with less iterations. Like if you explore the full grid, that's going to be expensive. But if you use something that can do it in a smarter way, then you can do it much more efficiently with Bayesian optimization of the hyperparameter space.
I think, you know, like, and just step back 1 step. If you're an expert, there are certain rules of thumb that generally work, but they're not great. And most people do what Dennis is saying, which is that rather than tuning them yourself and trying to like kind of figure out like trial and error what's going on, you actually have a computer program that does the trial and error for you. And so there are these Bayesian learning algorithms. There's like a grid search, which essentially says, here are all the knobs I can twist them all, you know, in every combination possible. And then there's some like really smart, interesting, you know, methods that are like adaptive methods that will try to do like find routes through the parameter space that make the most sense. But they're kind of all automated. So, you know, one of the steps that people can do before they train a model is go through one of these hyperparameter optimization steps. Oftentimes, the experience that I've had is that those take more time and effort than actually just getting it in like an inefficient set of parameters and then just running off.
Yeah.
You can get pretty close. Like you can get relatively, you can get like the 90% solution just through kind of rule of thumb. But you know, if you really want to tune this so that you converge fastest to a trained model that's you can use this technique.
Yeah. And also the hyperparameter space isn't really convex, which means there isn't like a unified minimum set of hyperparameters that are going to produce the best answer. There may be multiple sets of hyperparameters that are going to produce similarly good answers. So like the approach that most people would take when they're first working with neural nets would be looking at the loss curve. So you can take all of the results of evaluating the loss of your model or the accuracy, and you can look at that curve and see how quickly it's converging, and then you can kind of manually tune your learning rate and batch size. Like learning rate and batch size are going to be some of the most important hyperparameters to play with. In our case, the crop size is also going to be very important, but like you can manually tune those and look at the loss curve, see how quickly it's learning, and kind of do it like by hand. But that is kind of like an art form, like optimizing the hyperparameter space. Using automated techniques can make sure that you explore every avenue, but it does take more time potentially to get like marginal improvements.
Yeah, essentially what you're doing is you're running like a few epics every time. It's just kind of an automated way of doing this manual tuning. It's actually relatively coarse because it doesn't, as you said, it doesn't have like a global optimum. And so all these become really iterative. But yeah, the other thing too is a lot of examples that you find online have relatively decent learning rates and batch sizes already defined for like what they're running on. And so you can kind of go off those and a relatively decent solution.
Yeah.
Something that won't spiral.
Yeah. But the most important things, in my opinion, would be verifying your model against a well-distributed validation set. So we've like in initial training, but like it would be a good idea now to verify and validate the model with a validation set comprising the full distribution of patients that this would be applied against. Like every group of patient, anything that could be seen in the wild, like taking a distribution of data representative of that and then verifying and validating the model that way. And then like what we've done here with the explainable AI technique, where we've basically determined that this model probably isn't super good because it's just like utilizing the spine as a major consideration, and probably using the pneumonia spots as a negative attribution. Actually looking inside the box with some of these techniques is pretty important as well. So just some considerations before taking a model and putting it out to the world.
I'm curious, because half the most of the Boston, well, I don't know how you want, super diverse set of every type of patient, every scanner and stuff. Is there any appetite at all that you're seeing from like commercial AI products of like starting to have more like patient specific models, like, that this is a risk prediction algorithm that exists for this, for people that have this for people with heart disease, predicting
Yeah.
the outcome of, an adverse coronary event as opposed to just hunger.
Yeah, I think that that is a really good consideration, and that's something that I've considered like from my own research previously. So instead of having a global model trained with the good distribution of data, you could train models at the individual cluster level. So like, let's say that you learn that there's a cluster of patients that basically represents African American patients between a certain age range, and you know that this model works extremely well for predicting outcomes for those set of patients, but doesn't work well for the others. So having a set of models that work well for subpopulations of data is probably a really good idea. But in terms of implementing these models and deploying them, I think we're just starting to see models make their way out into the world, or there is interest in having them be used more fully, as we saw from the FDA regulatory information that I presented at the beginning. So I think we're still pretty early on. Like the AI revolution, like ResNet 18, I think came out in like 2018 or so. So we're still fairly young in this revolution of applying models or developing novel architectures.
And I'd say it's only been maybe the last couple of years where these considerations that you're talking about today, explainability, the models, understanding bias, has really kind of taken off. And I don't know, it's like, I mean, you can imagine like, as you're saying in FDA, and you can imagine the chasm that you need to cross to get to a point where you can actually feel these things.
Yeah, that's hard enough to develop that one thing that kind of works for those people.
Right.
Lots of stuff.
I think from a research perspective, there's a huge amount of, you see a lot of studies coming out, but from a clinical perspective, I couldn't even guess how long it would take to get.
Yep. Absolutely.
Great.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Like, yeah, I think it would be fun to, pull this and put it on to the really right training.